The thing about food preservation on the American frontier that most people misunderstand is this. The problem was not keeping food from spoiling in winter. Winter was easy. You hung your meat outside and it froze and stayed frozen until spring, and when you needed a meal, you hacked off a piece and thawed it and cooked it and ate it as fresh as the day the animal died. The problem was summer. The problem was the 6 months between April and October, when the temperature rose above 40 degrees and bacteria woke from their winter dormancy and began the ancient work of decomposition that turns fresh meat into poison within days. Salt could preserve meat, but salt was expensive, had to be transported from distant sources, and produced a product that tasted nothing like fresh meat and required hours of soaking before it could be cooked. Smoking could preserve meat, but smoking required constant attention, specialized equipment, and produced a product that was edible but far from the fresh roasts and steaks that families remembered from butchering season. Drying could preserve meat, but dried meat was tough, required rehydration, and lost most of the qualities that made fresh meat desirable. The frontier families of Missouri in the 1880s faced a choice every summer. They could eat preserved meat that tasted like salt, or smoke, or leather. They could slaughter fresh animals and eat the meat within days before it spoiled, wasting most of the carcass because a family could not consume an entire cow before the heat destroyed it. Or they could simply go without fresh meat for 6 months, supplementing their diet with eggs and milk and whatever protein they could catch day by day. None of these options was satisfactory. All of them were accepted as simply the way things were, the natural limitation of life before refrigeration, the price of living in a world where summer heat and bacterial growth were forces beyond human control. Nikolai Volkov did not accept these limitations. He had grown up in a world where winter was not a season but a way of life, where temperatures dropped to 50 below zero and stayed there for months, where the challenge was not preserving food in summer, but surviving at all in winter. He had seen ice that was cut in January and stored properly last until the following January, a full year of frozen preservation that seemed like magic to people who had never experienced a Russian winter. He had learned from his father and his grandfather and generations before them that cold was not a curse, but a resource, that winter could be harvested and stored and used when summer made fresh food impossible. And when he came to Missouri in 1885, following promises of good farmland and mild climate, he brought this knowledge with him the way other immigrants brought seeds and tools and family traditions. The knowledge that winter could last all year if you knew how to keep it. The settlement of Millbrook, Missouri, had never seen an ice house. They had heard of ice houses vaguely in stories about wealthy families in the East who had ice delivered to their homes even in summer, but they assumed this was a luxury of the rich, an expensive service that required constant resupply from ice merchants who shipped frozen blocks by rail from northern lakes. They did not know that ice could be harvested locally from any river or pond that froze solid in winter and stored in a properly insulated structure that would keep it frozen through the hottest summer. They did not know because no one had ever shown them. Nikolai showed them. If you want to understand how a Russian immigrant harvested winter from a Missouri river and kept meat fresh in August while his neighbors watched their food rot, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Nikolai and Yelena arrived in Millbrook in the spring of 1885, purchasing a small homestead on the edge of the settlement with savings accumulated from 15 years of labor in the iron foundries of Pennsylvania, where Nikolai had worked since emigrating from Russia in 1870. They were not young. Nikolai was 48, Yelena 43. They had no children, having lost 2 to illness in their early years and never being blessed with more. They had come to Missouri to farm, to live quietly, to spend their remaining years working land that belonged to them, rather than laboring in factories that belonged to others. The first summer taught them that Missouri was not Russia. The heat that arrived in June was unlike anything Nikolai had experienced, a humid, oppressive weight that made even breathing difficult, that caused food to spoil within hours of being left unprotected, that bred flies and maggots and bacteria with a fecundity that seemed almost malicious. They had brought salt pork from Pennsylvania, and it sustained them, but by August they had run out, and the only fresh meat available was what they could slaughter and consume immediately, or purchase from Virgil Stedman's general store at prices that would have bankrupted them within months. "I miss fresh meat," Yelena said one evening in August, as they ate another meal of vegetables and eggs and cornbread. "I miss the taste of it, the texture of it. In Russia, we had meat all winter from the autumn slaughter, frozen solid and fresh when we thawed it. Here, we have nothing but salt and smoke." Nikolai looked at his wife and felt something shift in his mind, a connection forming between the problem she had described and the knowledge he carried from his homeland. "In Russia," he said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it, "we kept meat frozen all winter because winter was long and cold enough to freeze anything. Here, winter is short and mild, but the principle is the same. Cold preserves meat. The question is how to keep cold when the air is hot." "Ice," Yelena said. "Yes," Nikolai agreed. "Ice. If I can cut ice from the river in January and keep it frozen until August, we can have fresh meat whenever we want it. We can store the autumn slaughter the way we did in Russia. The only difference is that in Russia, the world was our icehouse. Here, I must build the icehouse myself." The first attempt failed. Nikolai dug a pit in the ground, lined it with straw, filled it with ice blocks cut from the river in February, covered it with more straw and a wooden lid, and waited. By April, the ice was gone. The pit had flooded with groundwater that carried away the cold. The straw had compressed and lost its insulating value. The wooden lid had warped and let in warm air. The entire system had failed because Nikolai had not accounted for the differences between Missouri conditions and Russian conditions. In Russia, the ground was frozen solid for half the year, and a simple pit would stay cold because everything around it was cold. In Missouri, the ground held warmth from the previous summer well into winter, and a pit dug into that warm ground was fighting against a thermal mass that worked against preservation rather than for it. Nikolai studied his failure. He walked the countryside, looking at how other structures were built, how barns and cellars and spring houses managed temperature, how the few prosperous families in the area kept their butter and milk cool during summer. He observed, he thought, he planned, and the following winter, he built something different. The icehouse that Nikolai constructed in November of 1886 was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. It was built partially into a north-facing hillside, the back and sides protected by earth that stayed cool year-round. The walls were double-layered, 2 separate wooden walls with a 12-inch gap between them, filled entirely with sawdust, the waste product from a lumber mill 30 miles away that Nikolai had hauled by wagon load after load until he had enough to fill every gap in the structure. The floor was raised above the ground on wooden beams, with a drainage system beneath that would carry away any meltwater without allowing it to pool and conduct heat. The roof was similarly double-layered and insulated, with a ventilation gap at the peak that allowed any warm air that entered to rise and escape. The door was a massive construction, 4 inches thick, with 3 separate sealing surfaces that prevented any air exchange when closed. There were no windows, no gaps, no penetrations of any kind except the single door and the small drainage channel at the base. Virgil Stedman watched the construction with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Stedman owned the general store that sold salt and smoking supplies to every family in the settlement. He made substantial profit from the food preservation trade, selling 50-pound bags of salt at prices that included a healthy markup for his trouble. The Russians' strange building threatened that business, though Stedman did not yet understand how. "That is a peculiar barn," Stedman observed one day, riding past on his way to town. "No windows, double walls. What do you intend to keep in it?" "Winter," Nikolai replied. Stedman laughed. The Russian had a strange sense of humor. Everyone knew you could not keep winter. Winter came and went according to its own schedule, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. "Winter is not something you store in a barn," Stedman said condescendingly. "Winter is a season. It comes, it goes. You cannot put it in a building and save it for later." Nikolai smiled, but did not argue. He had learned that Americans did not respond well to being told they were wrong. They preferred to discover their errors themselves, preferably after the person they had dismissed had been proven right in a way that could not be denied. He would wait for summer. The ice harvest began in January of 1887, when the river had frozen solid to a depth of 14 inches. Nikolai had spent the autumn preparing, building a set of ice saws from designs he remembered from Russia, constructing a horse-drawn sledge that could transport ice blocks without exposing them to excessive warmth, clearing a path from the river to his ice house that minimized the distance the ice would need to travel. The work took 2 weeks. Nikolai and a hired hand cut blocks of ice 18 inches square, prying them from the frozen river with iron bars, loading them onto the sledge, hauling them to the ice house, and stacking them in careful layers with sawdust packed between each layer and against every wall. The ice blocks were stacked to a height of 7 feet, filling the ice house almost to the ceiling, then covered with a final layer of sawdust 2 feet thick that would protect the top surface from the warm air that would inevitably accumulate at the ceiling level. When the work was complete, Nikolai had stored approximately 12 tons of ice in a structure that covered perhaps 300 square feet. 12 tons of frozen water, cut from a river that froze every winter for free. Packed in sawdust that the lumber mill paid him to haul away because they had no other use for it. The total cost, excluding his own labor, was less than $10 for the hired hand's wages and the lumber for the sledge and saws. The ice would last until the following winter if properly managed. It would provide refrigeration for meat, for butter, for milk, for anything that needed to be kept cold all summer long, for a fraction of what Stedman charged for the salt that provided a far inferior form of preservation. Nikolai sealed the door and waited for summer. The first test came in June, when Nikolai slaughtered a hog. In ordinary circumstances, a family would need to consume or preserve an entire hog within days of slaughter, salting and smoking as fast as possible before the summer heat could spoil the meat. Nikolai did neither. He carried the butchered carcass to his ice house, opened the massive door for the first time since January, and stepped into winter. The temperature inside the ice house was 34 degrees. The ice blocks that he had stacked 5 months earlier were still frozen solid, still blue-white and hard as stone, still radiating the cold of a January day that had been captured and preserved while the world outside moved through spring and into summer. Frost formed on the surface of the meat as soon as he hung it from the hooks he had installed along one wall. The moisture in the air condensed and froze, coating the fresh pork in a thin layer of ice that would protect it from the drying effects of cold air while keeping it frozen solid for as long as he wanted to store it. He closed the door and went back to the summer world, where the temperature was 92 degrees and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. The difference between the two worlds, separated by 4 inches of wood and 12 inches of sawdust, was nearly 60 degrees. The pork lasted 3 weeks, not because it spoiled, but because Nikolai and Yelena ate it, cutting fresh portions every few days, enjoying roast pork and pork chops and pork tenderloin in July, while their neighbors ate salt pork and smoked ham and wished for something that tasted like the meat they remembered from autumn. The neighbors noticed. They noticed because Yelena mentioned it at the general store, casually, not boasting but simply commenting that the fresh pork they were having for dinner that night was particularly good. They noticed because the smell of roasting fresh meat drifted from the Volkov homestead in the evenings, a smell that should not have existed in July, a smell that reminded everyone of what they were missing. They noticed because Nikolai, when asked directly, did not lie. "I have ice," he said simply. "I cut it from the river in January. I store it in sawdust. It keeps meat frozen all summer. It is not difficult. It is not expensive. It is simply a technique that Russians have used for centuries." The reaction was not what Nikolai had hoped. He had expected curiosity, interest, perhaps requests to learn the technique. What he received was suspicion. Virgil Stedman led the skepticism. His business depended on people needing salt and smoking supplies to preserve their food. If ice storage became common, his sales would plummet. He had a financial interest in making sure that the Russians' technique was dismissed as impractical, foreign, and probably dangerous. "Ice cannot last through summer," Stedman announced at his store, where settlers gathered to purchase supplies and exchange gossip. Everyone knows that ice melts in heat. The Russian is lying about something, probably storing his meat in a cold spring or a cave somewhere and claiming it is ice. No one can keep ice frozen from January to July. It is physically impossible. The settlers nodded along because Stedman was a respected businessman and the Russian was a foreigner with strange habits who barely spoke comprehensible English. It was easier to believe that Nikolai was lying or confused than to believe that he had discovered something that none of them had thought of, something that could transform their lives if they were willing to learn from an immigrant. The summer of 1887 passed. Nikolai's Icehouse continued to function perfectly. He slaughtered a second hog in August and stored it alongside beef from a steer he had purchased from a neighbor who was happy to sell rather than go through the labor of salting and smoking. By October, when the first frost arrived and outdoor refrigeration became possible again, Nikolai still had ice in his icehouse, perhaps half of what he had stored in January. More than enough to demonstrate that summer-long ice storage was not only possible, but practical. He had eaten fresh meat every week for 6 months while his neighbors ate preserved food or went without. He had kept butter firm and milk sweet through the hottest days of summer. He had proven, to himself at least, that the technique worked exactly as he had known it would. The second winter, he stored more ice. He expanded his icehouse, adding a second chamber that could hold additional blocks and provide more cold storage space. He refined his technique, experimenting with different sawdust depths and different stacking patterns to find the configuration that minimized melting By the summer of 1888, he was storing not only his own meat, but meat for two neighboring families who had quietly asked if they could pay him to preserve their autumn slaughter rather than going through the salt and smoke process they had always used. Stedman noticed the declining sales. He noticed that families who had previously bought 50 pounds of salt for summer preservation were now buying 20 pounds or less. He noticed that his smoking supplies sat on the shelves longer than they used to. He did not connect these changes to the Russians' Icehouse because he had convinced himself that the Icehouse could not possibly work, and evidence that contradicted his conviction was simply ignored as anomalous. The crisis came in August of 1889, 4 summers after Nikolai had built his Icehouse. An outbreak of illness struck the settlement, later determined to be food poisoning from improperly cured meat that had been sold by a traveling peddler. 11 families were affected. 3 people died, including 2 children. The rest were sick for weeks, unable to work, unable to care for their livestock, unable to do anything but suffer through the vomiting and fever that the tainted meat had caused. The Volkov family was not affected. They had not purchased meat from the peddler because they did not need to. They had fresh meat stored in their icehouse, meat that was frozen solid, meat that had been preserved not by salt or smoke or the dubious practices of a traveling merchant, but by the simple cold of ice that had been cut from a river 8 months earlier. When the investigation into the outbreak began, when the families who had been sickened demanded answers about why the meat had been bad and who was responsible, someone mentioned that the Russian family had not been affected. Someone asked why. And Nikolai, when questioned, explained about his icehouse. The reaction was different this time. 3 people were dead. Families had nearly lost children. The theoretical objections that had allowed people to dismiss the icehouse as impossible or impractical suddenly seemed less important than the practical reality that the Volkov family had fresh, safe meat while everyone else had been poisoned by preservation methods that had failed. "We want to see it," Thomas Perkins said. He was a farmer whose son had nearly died from the tainted meat and who had spent 2 weeks nursing the boy back to health. "We want to see this icehouse that keeps meat frozen in August. Show us how it works." Nikolai opened his icehouse for the first time to outside visitors. He led them through the massive door, into the cold that shocked them with its intensity, into a space where their breath condensed and their skin prickled, and the summer heat of 95 degrees was a memory from another world. The ice was there, blue-white blocks stacked in neat rows, sawdust packed between them, the cold radiating from every surface. The meat was there, sides of beef and pork hanging from hooks, frozen solid, frost-covered, perfectly preserved after weeks or months of storage. The temperature was there, 36 degrees in August, a full 60 degrees colder than the air outside, cold enough to stop bacterial growth, cold enough to keep meat fresh indefinitely, cold enough to make summer and winter exist simultaneously in spaces separated by nothing more than sawdust and wood. "How?" Perkins asked. His voice was barely a whisper, the shock of what he was seeing overcoming his usual confidence. "How is this possible?" "Sawdust," Nikolai said. He reached down and grabbed a handful of the material that packed every gap and covered every surface. "Sawdust is mostly air. Air does not conduct heat well. The ice stays cold because the heat from outside cannot reach it through the sawdust. The same principle keeps your house warm in winter. You put straw or cloth in the walls, and the cold from outside cannot reach the warm air inside. This is the same, only reversed. The cold inside cannot reach the warm air outside. Perkins looked at the sawdust in Nikolai's hand. The lumber mill gives this away for free. They have mountains of it. They would pay someone to haul it away. Yes, Nikolai said. The ice is free also. The river freezes every winter. Anyone can cut it. The only cost is the building and the labor. Once built, the icehouse costs nothing to operate. The ice stays frozen because physics says it must stay frozen, and physics does not charge rent. The word spread through the settlement within days. People who had dismissed the icehouse came to see it for themselves. People who had laughed at the Russian strange building now stood inside it, shivering in the cold, marveling at the ice that had survived 8 months of Missouri summer without melting. People who had paid premium prices to Virgil Stedman for salt and smoking supplies now calculated how much they could save by storing their meat in ice instead. The reckoning came at a community gathering in September, after the heat had broken and people could think clearly about what they had learned. The gathering was held at the Millbrook Church, and nearly every family in the settlement attended, including Virgil Stedman, who sat in the back with his arms crossed and his face set in an expression that suggested he was preparing to defend himself against accusations he knew were coming. Thomas Perkins spoke first. He had become the unofficial leader of the group that wanted to learn from Nikolai, the families who were tired of salt pork and smokehouse failures, and the constant fear that preserved food might be preserved wrong and poison their families. 3 people died last month from bad meat, Perkins said. My son nearly joined them. We have spent years buying salt and smoking our meat and praying that we did it right, and still we get poisoned. Meanwhile, the Russian has been eating fresh meat all summer for 4 years. Meat that is frozen solid in August. Meat that is as safe as the day it was butchered. He looked at Stedman. Some of us were told that ice storage was impossible. Some of us were told that the Russian was lying or crazy or both. Some of us believed it because we trusted the person who told us, because it was easier to believe that a foreigner was wrong than to believe that we might learn something from him. He paused. I am done believing what is easy. I want to learn what is true. I want to build an ice house. I want to eat fresh meat in August. And I want an apology from anyone who told me it could not be done. Stedman did not apologize. He stood up, his face red with anger and embarrassment, and began a defense that no one wanted to hear. I was protecting you from foreign nonsense. The Russian comes from a frozen wasteland where ice is everywhere. Of course, he knows about ice, but Missouri is not Russia. Our winters are mild. Our summers are hot. The techniques that work there cannot possibly work here. The physics are different. The conditions are different. Everything is different. The physics are the same everywhere, Nikolai said quietly. He had not planned to speak, preferring to let his icehouse speak for him. But Stedman's claim about physics being different in different countries was too wrong to let stand. Cold is cold in Russia and in Missouri. Ice melts when heat reaches it in Russia and in Missouri. Sawdust insulates in Russia and in Missouri. The only difference is that in Russia, we learned these things centuries ago, and in Missouri, you are learning them today. There is no shame in learning. There is only shame in refusing to learn. Stedman left the meeting without speaking further. His business would survive, diminished but functional, because not everyone would build ice houses, and some people would always prefer the familiar methods of salt and smoke. But his authority was broken. His certainty had been proven wrong in a way that 3 deaths had made impossible to ignore. He would never again be able to dismiss immigrant knowledge as foreign nonsense, because the consequences of that dismissal were now buried in the cemetery on the hill. The construction began that autumn. Nikolai supervised the building of 7 ice houses across the Millbrook settlement, teaching families how to site the structures on north-facing slopes, how to build double walls with proper insulation gaps, how to pack sawdust to maximize its insulating value, how to cut and stack ice blocks for minimum meltage. By January of 1890, 8 ice houses, including Nikolai's original, were ready to receive the winter's harvest. The ice cutting became a community event. Families who had previously viewed January as a miserable month to be endured now saw it as harvest season, a time when the river yielded a crop as valuable as any planted in spring. They cut ice together, loaded sledges together, stacked blocks in each other's ice houses together. The work that had been Nikolai's alone became shared labor that built bonds between families who had previously had little in common. The following summer, fresh meat was no longer unusual in Millbrook. Families roasted beef in July, served pork chops in August, enjoyed steaks and roasts and all the fresh meat they had dreamed of during previous summers, when salt and smoke were the only options. The death rate from food poisoning dropped to 0 and stayed there. The money that had previously gone to Stedman's salt supplies went instead to other needs. The quality of life improved in ways that statistics cannot capture, but families remember forever. Nikolai Volkov lived on his Missouri homestead for another 23 years. Passing in the spring of 1912 at the age of 75. Yelena survived him by 4 years, maintaining the ice house that they had built together until she joined him in the small cemetery that their fresh meat had helped keep from filling prematurely. The ice house itself stood until the 1940s, when rural electrification brought mechanical refrigeration to the settlement and made ice storage obsolete. The last blocks of ice were cut in the winter of 1938. The last meat was hung in the summer of 1939, and by 1945, the structure had been dismantled for its lumber. But the principle remained. The knowledge that winter could be harvested and stored, that cold was a resource rather than merely a condition, that immigrant techniques could solve problems that native methods could not. This knowledge outlasted the building that had demonstrated it. The phrase Russian storage entered the vocabulary of the Missouri frontier and spread across the region. It meant preserving things the old way, the immigrant way, the way that worked when modern methods failed. It was spoken with respect, as if the speaker understood something about cold and sawdust and the physics that kept ice frozen through summer. Above the door of Nikolai's ice house, he had carved an inscription in both Russian and English in the year after the food poisoning outbreak, when the community had finally accepted what he had been trying to teach them. The inscription read, "Zima живет здесь." Winter lives here. The settlers who had dismissed his building as madness, who had insisted that ice could not survive summer, who had watched their families get poisoned by preserved meat while the Russian ate fresh roasts, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learn something from this story about ice harvesting and sawdust insulation and the physics that kept one family fed safely while their neighbors suffered, subscribe to this channel, because we have more stories about the forgotten preservation techniques that kept people alive before refrigeration made everyone forget how to store winter. The rivers still freeze every January. The sawdust is still free at the lumber mill. The only question is whether we remember how to use them.